Catherine, remembered by history as Catherine Parr, Queen of England, the sixth and final wife of King Henry VIII, the most married queen in the history of the English throne, the first woman in England to publish an original work in English under her own name, and the stepmother who shaped the minds of 3 future monarchs. She was born into a world of quiet power, a courtier's daughter in a court that devoured the unwary whole. She lost her father before she could truly know him, and learned early that survival in Tudor England demanded not just courage, but wisdom. She was widowed young, and widowed again, and still she endured. And then the most dangerous man in England turned his gaze upon her, and she had no choice but to accept. For 4 long years she stood beside a king who had divorced 2 wives, beheaded 2 more, and outlived a 5th. She managed him with patience, guided him with care, and used every quiet hour she could find to change England from within. She governed the kingdom in his absence. She picked up a pen and signed her name to it in an age when women were not supposed to do such things, and when a warrant bearing her own husband's signature was drawn up for her arrest, when the shadow of the tower fell across her life as it had fallen across the lives of her predecessors. She did not flee. She walked to him. She looked him in the eye, and she talked her way free. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you have just subscribed, welcome to the family. And if you are returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a pleasure to have you here. Tonight, make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, and let the day gently slip away. Over the next few hours, we will share the calm and complete story of Catherine Parr, a woman of extraordinary intelligence, deep faith, and remarkable courage, who navigated the most treacherous royal court in Europe and left behind a legacy that shaped the future of England itself. We will softly explore her life in full, from her earliest years as a courtier's daughter raised among the books and languages of a well-ordered Tudor household, through her 3 marriages before she ever came near the king, her time as Queen of England and Queen Regent, her near-fatal encounter with a heresy charge, and her final bittersweet chapter of love, pregnancy, and loss, all told slowly and with care to help guide you into sleep. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which of Catherine's 4 marriages you find the most fascinating help keep these stories coming. In the summer of the year 1512, in a townhouse nestled in the parish of Blackfriars on the north bank of the River Thames, a child was born to a family of considerable standing at the court of England. Her father was Sir Thomas Parr, a man whose lineage reached back into the ancient nobility of the north, whose family had long held the manor of Kendal in the county of Westmoreland, and whose daily life was conducted not among the windswept moorlands of the north, but in London, where the business of the kingdom was transacted, and where men of good family and sound judgment could make their reputations in the service of a crown that rewarded loyalty generously. Her mother was Maud Green, a woman of intelligence, warmth, and genuine standing, who had risen to become a lady-in-waiting to the Queen herself, to Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish-born princess who had married Henry VIII just 3 years before, and was now establishing her household at court with a composed and dignified authority that would mark her long and eventually tragic tenure as England's Queen Consort. The child born to Sir Thomas and Lady Maud in that summer would be named Catherine, and in the choosing of that name, a small but meaningful thread was drawn between 2 women who would, in time, be connected by far more than the custom of godmotherhood. for it was almost certainly in honour of Queen Catherine of Aragon herself that the baby was named, and it was Catherine of Aragon who stood as the infant's godmother, creating a bond that would be remembered and spoken of throughout Catherine Parr's life. It was a world of privilege, but not of comfort in any simple or unexamined sense. The Tudor court of Henry VIII's early years was a place of extraordinary energy. The king himself, who celebrated his 21st birthday just weeks before Catherine Parr's birth, was everything that the scholars and poets of the age called a Renaissance prince. He was tall and vigorous, trained in music and languages, genuinely interested in theology and philosophy, and given to a generosity of spirit, a quality that would in time harden into its opposite, but which in the summer of 1512 was still open and real. He surrounded himself with brilliant people. Thomas More was his friend. Erasmus had celebrated him in print. The great currents of Renaissance learning were flowing through England with a freshness and excitement that made Henry's court one of the most culturally alive places in the Christian world. Sir Thomas Parr moved easily in this world. He served as comptroller to the king, a role that placed him at the practical centre of royal administration, responsible for the smooth running of the household and the management of its considerable demands. He was later appointed Master of the Household, and he had been knighted in the early years of Henry's reign, as a mark of the royal trust he had earned through years of loyal service. He was, in every sense that mattered in Tudor England, a man of substance and standing. His wife Maud was no less capable. The Queen's household was not assembled through social connection alone. Catherine of Aragon was famously careful about the women she kept near her, preferring those of genuine education and sound character, and Maud Green had evidently met that demanding standard. The two women were genuine friends across the years of their shared court life, a friendship that would give young Catherine Parr a godmother who was also a queen, and a mother who was intimately acquainted with the inner life of the highest household in the land. Into this world of learning and careful ambition, Catherine arrived as the first of 3 children. After her came a brother named William, who would grow up to become a significant figure at court in his own right, eventually elevated to the Marquessate of Northampton, a man of reformist sympathies who would sponsor the publication of his sister's most daring literary work. And then there was a younger sister named Anne, who would marry William Herbert, later created the first Earl of Pembroke, and become one of the trusted members of the reformist circle that her elder sister would one day gather around her as queen. All 3 children would grow up under a shadow they did not yet know was coming, the early loss of a father, and in the steady, capable care of a mother whose strength they would each, in different ways, carry forward into their own lives. Sir Thomas Parr died around the year 1517. Catherine was approximately 5 years old. The details of his death, its cause, its precise timing, the circumstances in which a family was left to reorganize itself around a sudden absence, are not preserved in the record with any particular clarity. What is preserved is the effect. 3 small children, the eldest barely old enough to form clear memories of her father, were left in the care of their mother. Maud Parr was in her late 20s, a young widow with no husband to manage the family estates, no male figure to provide the legal authority that Tudor society located exclusively in men, and 3 children whose futures depended entirely on how well she navigated the years ahead. She navigated them remarkably well. She drew on the family's network of connections with practical intelligence. Her brother-in-law, Sir William Parr of Horton, provided guidance and support. the distant cousin of the family Cuthbert Tunstall, at that time Bishop of Durham, and one of the most respected churchmen and scholars in England, offered something of the fatherly oversight that the children lacked. The family spent time at Rye House in Hertfordshire, within the household of their uncle, where Lady Parr assembled not only her own 3 children, but others from families of similar standing, creating a small and well-ordered domestic world in which learning was the primary business of the day, and where the discipline of education gave structure to lives that might otherwise have been difficult to organize. Education was the great gift that Maud Parr gave her children, and she gave it with complete conviction. She understood, with a clarity unusual in any era, and particularly striking in the early 16th century. That knowledge was a form of protection. A well-educated daughter was more useful, more capable, more likely to manage the inevitable difficulties of the life ahead of her, than a daughter whose accomplishments were merely ornamental. And so, Catherine Parr was taught languages. She learned French with the easy fluency that came from early instruction. The language of diplomacy, of much of the best literature circulating in educated households, and of the royal court itself, where French was spoken alongside English as the natural tongue of the aristocracy. She learned Italian, the tongue of the Renaissance, the language in which the new learning of the age was written and debated by the scholars who were reshaping European thought. She studied Latin, the language of the church, of the law, of medicine, of the ancient texts that form the backbone of any serious intellectual life. She showed an aptitude for languages that remained one of her distinguishing qualities throughout her life. By the time she became queen, she was not merely competent in these tongues, but genuinely fluent in them, capable of reading and conversing and eventually corresponding across 3 languages with ease. She was also interested in medicine, not in any formal or professional sense, since the medical profession was closed to women, but in the practical manner of an educated Tudor noblewoman who understood that the management of a household included the management of its health. She read the medical texts that circulated in educated households. She developed knowledge of herbs and their properties, of the treatments available for the common ailments of the age. This practical medical knowledge would serve her in ways she could not yet anticipate, through the long, slow decline of 2 elderly husbands, through the nursing care she would provide with patient consistency to men who depended on her skill and her attention. These were not accomplishments assembled for display, or for the social currency of being considered accomplished. In Catherine's hands, every piece of learning she acquired would eventually be put to use. The languages she studied in her mother's household would allow her to read the reformist texts that were reshaping European theology at their source, without the mediation of translations. They would allow her to correspond with scholars and statespeople across Europe. They would allow her to engage Henry VIII in precisely the kind of learned conversation that stimulated his genuine intellectual interests and kept her, in those early dangerous years of their marriage, interesting and useful to him. And the writing she would eventually produce, the books that would make her the first Englishwoman to publish in her own name, could only have come from someone who had spent decades reading seriously and thinking carefully about what she read. Around her, the England of Catherine Parr's childhood was undergoing changes that none of its inhabitants fully understood while they were living through them. The great religious upheaval of the Reformation was making itself felt across Europe with a speed that alarmed the traditional authorities and excited those who were hungry for change. Martin Luther in Germany had set the argument in motion, his challenge to the authority of Rome. his insistence on Scripture alone as the ultimate guide to faith, his attack on the financial and moral corruption of the Church as it existed. His ideas were spreading through the channels opened by the printing press, which was carrying pamphlets and tracts and arguments from city to city and country to country, faster than any authority could suppress them. In England, for the moment, the king was committed to the defense of the old faith. Henry VIII had written against Luther with genuine theological engagement and had received from the Pope the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, in recognition of his loyalty to Rome. The Parr household, like virtually every household in England, was Catholic in its practice, its prayers following the ancient rhythms of a church that had been the spiritual home of the English people for centuries. But things were moving. The ground beneath the church's feet was beginning to shift in ways that would eventually change everything. By the time Catherine was approaching her teenage years, her mother was thinking practically about the next stage of her daughter's life. A well-made marriage was the central objective for a young woman of Catherine's standing, and Lady Parr was determined to secure one that reflected the family's connections and ambitions. Around 1523, when Catherine was approximately 11 years old, Lady Parr entered into negotiations for a match between Catherine and the grandson of Lord Dacre of the North, one of the most powerful noble families in the northern counties, with deep connections on the Scottish border and a long history of service to the English crown in its most strategically important region. The negotiations came to nothing. The specific reasons for their failure are not recorded, though the complications that undid such early arrangements were usually matters of financial terms. The precise settlement, the jointure, the dower lands, the provisions that would support the young couple, and, in the event of widowhood, protect the bride. Whatever the cause, the match did not proceed. Lady Maud Parr died around 1531. Catherine was approximately 19. She had already, by that point, been married for 2 years and had passed out of her mother's immediate household. But the death of Maud Parr removed from her life the woman who had been its most important formative presence, the person who had made her what she was, in every way that could be made rather than simply born. The qualities that would carry Catherine Parr through the remarkable decades ahead of her, the patient intelligence, the linguistic gifts, the practical capability, the steady faith, the ability to read difficult situations with clarity and respond to them with composure. All of these had been cultivated in the household that Maud Green had managed with such care and such evident purpose after the death of Sir Thomas Parr. By the time her mother died, Catherine was already a widow herself. Her first marriage had taken place in the year 1529. She was approximately 16 years old, the age at which a young woman of good family was expected to be moving into her adult life, and her husband was Sir Edward Burgh, a young man of about 21 or 22 from an established Lincolnshire family. His grandfather had been honoured by the Yorkist kings and had served in positions of considerable trust. His father, Thomas Burgh, was Chamberlain to Anne Boleyn, which placed the family in the orbit of the royal court during one of the most turbulent and dramatic periods in its history. Of the day-to-day texture of this first marriage, history offers us very little. Edward Burgh does not emerge from the record as a vivid or particularly defined personality. There were no children from the marriage. Whether the partnership was warm or merely comfortable, whether Catherine felt affection for her young husband, or simply the steady companionship of two people making the best of an arranged situation, none of this can be established with confidence. What can be established is that Edward Burgh's health failed, and that by the early months of 1533, at the latest, he was dead. Catherine was 20 years old. She was an orphaned widow, childless, with a modest income from the widow's portion of her late husband's estate, and with the entire question of what her life would now look like entirely unresolved. The Tudor world offered widows of her age and social position exactly one socially acceptable path forward: another marriage. She would need to find one or have one found for her, and she would need to do so without excessive delay. In the meantime, there is a tradition, uncertain but plausible, that she withdrew north, possibly staying with a cousin of the Parr family at Snape Castle in Westmoreland, returning to the northern landscape with which her family had always been associated, even if she herself had been born and raised in London. Whether this is exactly accurate or not, it was through the network of exactly these northern connections that she would soon be introduced to the man who would become her second husband. The Tudor court, in which Catherine spent her earliest years, was a place of genuine spectacle as well as genuine substance. Henry VIII's court was one of the largest households in Europe. Hundreds of servants, officials, and attendants moving through its great rooms at Hampton Court and Greenwich and Whitehall, their ranks organised by a system of careful gradations that determined who could pass through which door, who could stand in which room, and who could approach the royal presence directly. At the top of this elaborately ordered world was the king himself, and below him, in parallel households that mirrored his own, were the queen and the prince. The women of the queen's household, Catherine of Aragon's ladies, among whom young Catherine Parr's mother occupied a position of genuine standing, lived their daily lives in a world of remarkable richness and constant activity. They attended their mistress at meals, at prayer, at recreation. They accompanied her on the great formal occasions that marked the court's public life. They were part of the machinery of royal display, and through that machinery, they were witnesses to and participants in the affairs of the kingdom in ways that women of lower social standing could never have accessed. For a child growing up in this environment, and Catherine, as the daughter of a lady-in-waiting and a royal official, would have been present in and around court circles from her earliest years. The education was not only the formal instruction of the schoolroom, it was also the continuous informal education of observation. Watching how powerful people behaved, how alliances were formed and broken, how the language of compliment and petition and negotiation operated in the spaces between the formal occasions, what it meant to be trusted and what it meant to fall from trust. These lessons were absorbed through the pause, as it were, rather than from any text, but they were no less real or lasting for that, and in Catherine's case, they would prove to be some of the most practically useful knowledge she ever acquired. The formal instruction was rigorous. Sir Thomas Parr, before his death, had been part of a court circle that included some of the finest minds of the age. Men like Thomas More, who was one of the great humanist scholars of Europe, and who believed with great conviction that women were capable of serious education and should receive it, who educated his own daughters to a standard that was unusual and celebrated. The intellectual atmosphere of Henry VIII's early court was one in which the education of well-born children, including girls, was taken seriously and discussed openly. The influence of Erasmus and the continental humanists, who argued that a full education in the classical languages and the great texts of antiquity was the proper foundation for any Christian life, was felt in the way tutors were engaged and in the texts they were given to teach. Catherine's linguistic abilities developed steadily through the years of her mother's careful management. French was likely the first and most naturally acquired of her languages beyond English. It was spoken at court, in the documents of government, in the literature that educated people read for pleasure, and in the religious texts that were beginning to be translated from the Latin for broader audiences. The French that Catherine learned in her mother's household was not a foreign language in the sense of a difficult acquisition, but something closer to a second native tongue, absorbed in an environment where it was used daily. Italian required more deliberate study. It was the language of the new learning in its most exciting forms, the tongue of the scholars and poets whose ideas were reshaping European intellectual life, and Catherine applied herself to it with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Latin was the most demanding, and also, perhaps, the most consequential of the three, the key that unlocked the vast libraries of theological and classical learning that had accumulated over centuries, that allowed a reader to approach the original texts of the Church Fathers, of the ancient historians, of the reformist scholars who were producing their arguments in the scholarly lingua franca of the age. It is worth pausing on what this linguistic preparation meant for the woman Catherine would become. The Bible that was beginning to circulate in England was a translation from texts in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. The reformist arguments that were reshaping European Christianity were made, in their most original and rigorous forms, in Latin. The theological debates that Catherine would eventually engage in, both in her private reading and in the discussions of her queen's household, and eventually in her own published work, required access to texts that were not available in English. Her education gave her that access. It made her a reader of the Reformation's primary literature, rather than a reader of its secondary popularizations. This was not a small thing. It was part of what allowed her to hold theological positions that were genuinely her own, arrived at through genuine engagement with the sources, rather than positions borrowed from someone else's summary. The England of Catherine's childhood was also beneath its court glitter and its Renaissance enthusiasm, a country in which the ordinary material conditions of life were harsh by any modern standard. Disease was everywhere, and medicine was largely powerless before its most serious manifestations. Plague was a recurring presence in the City of London. One of the reasons that the court moved constantly between its various palaces and houses, trying to stay ahead of the infection that spread with terrifying speed in crowded urban environments. Childbirth was dangerous. Infections that could be managed with antibiotics today were fatal then. The life expectancy of even the most privileged was unpredictable in ways that shaped how people understood time and urgency and the importance of making good use of the years one was given. Catherine would lose her father at 5, her mother at 19, her first husband at 20, and her second husband at 30. She had lost, by the time Henry VIII proposed to her, more than most people of her generation had been expected to absorb and survive, and she had survived each of these losses and continued, educated herself further, managed more difficult situations, grown more capable through each successive test. This was not the survival of someone who had been protected from difficulty. It was the survival of someone who had been tested repeatedly and had found each time that they had more in them than the test required. John Neville, the 3rd Baron Latimer of Snape Castle in the North Riding of Yorkshire, was in almost every meaningful respect a different kind of man from the somewhat shadowy figure of Edward Burgh. He was born in 1493, which made him, at the time of his marriage to Catherine in the summer of 1534, a man of 41, approximately 19 or 20 years older than his new bride. He had been twice widowed before Catherine entered his life. His first wife, Dorothy de Vere, had given him 2 children before her death in 1527, a son named John, who stood as his heir and who would eventually succeed to the barony, and a daughter named Margaret. His second marriage, to Elizabeth Musgrave, had been brief and childless, ending with Elizabeth's death in 1530. He was a man who had already lived through a great deal, had managed estates, raised children, sat in Parliament, served on the Administrative Council of the North, and had seen something of the shape that a life in the governance of England's most complex and turbulent region could take. The Neville family carried one of the most resonant names in all of English aristocratic history. A century before John Neville's time, the Nevilles had stood at the very centre of the kingdom's political life. The great magnates of the North, whose power and wealth had made them kingmakers in the truest sense, men who had shaped the Wars of the Roses and whose influence had sometimes seemed to rival that of the crown itself. Those days of supreme Neville dominance were long past by 1534, their power broken by the political extinctions of the 15th century and the subsequent centralising of royal authority under the Tudors. But the name still carried enormous prestige, and the Neville lands in Yorkshire, the castle at Snape with its surrounding estates, and the house in London at Charterhouse Square, where the family maintained a presence during those seasons when their duties brought them south, were substantial and well-managed properties that spoke of a family that had weathered the storms of political change and emerged with its material foundations intact. Lord Latimer himself was an active and respected figure in the governing life of the North. He sat on the Council of the North, the administrative body through which the Crown exercised its authority over England's most geographically remote and politically difficult region, a region that had its own customs, its own loyalties, and its own ways of conducting the business of governance that did not always map neatly onto the expectations of the court in London. He represented Yorkshire in Parliament, bringing to the national legislative process the specific perspective and interests of a county that was large, populous, and acutely sensitive to any suggestion that its traditional way of life was under threat. He had served as a young man in the King's body of elite attendants, and he had been knighted after the English capture of the city of Tournai during Henry VIII's French campaign of 1513. A mark of military participation and royal favour that sat comfortably within the conventional expectations of a man of his birth and position. His principal seat, Snape Castle, stood in the quiet countryside of the North Riding near Leyburn, a solid, ancient pile of stone that had been in the Neville family for generations, its walls thickened by the history of a northern nobility that had always known the possibility of violence from the north, from the west, from below, and had built accordingly. The surrounding landscape of Yorkshire dales and moors was very different from anything Catherine had known in her London childhood, or her brief years in Lincolnshire. Larger, wilder, more horizontal, under skies that could change from clear to dangerous in an hour, and that gave the people who lived beneath them a different relationship with the natural world than those who had grown up in the south. Catherine came to this marriage with qualities and capabilities that had been tested and refined by the years since her first widowhood. She was 21 or 22 years old, no longer the 16-year-old girl who had gone to Lincolnshire as Edward Borough's wife, but a young woman who had managed a household, experienced a loss, navigated a period of personal uncertainty, and come through it with her intelligence and composure intact. She stepped into the role of Lady Latimer, stepmother to John and Margaret Neville, mistress of Snape Castle and the London house at Charterhouse Square, wife to a man 20 years her senior, whose position in Yorkshire's governing life brought a steady stream of visitors, obligations and demands. And she did so with the ease of someone who had been prepared for exactly this kind of responsibility, and who was ready to take it seriously. The marriage to Lord Latimer appears, by all available evidence, to have been a genuine and warm partnership. There were no children. Lord Latimer had fathered children before, and Catherine would show in her last marriage that she was capable of pregnancy. But the 9 years between 1534 and 1543 produced no offspring. Whether this was a matter of biology or circumstance is not possible to determine. What we can say is that the relationship between Catherine and her second husband was characterized by real mutual trust, a trust Lord Latimer expressed formally in his will, leaving Catherine well provided for, naming her guardian of his daughter Margaret, and entrusting to her the management of affairs that he might otherwise have passed to male relatives. He believed in her, he relied on her, and she gave him every reason to do so. Lord Latimer's religious sympathies were with the old faith. He was not an enthusiast for the changes being driven through England's church by Henry VIII and his formidable minister Thomas Cromwell. He had participated in the legal processes, the parliamentary statutes that made the king supreme head of the Church of England, the acts that authorized the dissolution of the monasteries. Because a man of his position had very limited options when it came to opposing the will of a monarch who brooked no dissent. But he participated without enthusiasm, and the direction of his personal beliefs remained with the Catholic practices that had sustained the religious life of the North for centuries. The North of England generally shared this conservatism. The monasteries dissolved by Cromwell's commissioners had been woven into the social and economic fabric of northern communities in ways that went far deeper than mere sentiment. They had provided charity, education, hospitality, and the kind of spiritual anchor that gave the rhythms of the year their meaning. Their destruction was felt as a genuine assault on a way of life. Catherine's own religious position in these years was more fluid. She had been raised Catholic, as everyone in England had been. She continued, as Lady Latimer in a household led by a man of traditional faith, to observe the Catholic forms that her position required. But she was curious, and she was reading, and the books available to an educated woman in the 1530s increasingly included texts that were probing and challenging the settled certainties of the old faith. The argument of the Reformation, about the authority of Scripture, about the relationship between the individual soul and God, about whether salvation required the mediation of a priestly institution or could be grasped directly through faith, was not a distant theological debate. It was a living controversy that was working its way into every educated household in England, pressing itself on anyone with eyes to read and a mind engaged enough to follow an argument. Catherine was such a person, and the years at Snape were years in which her thinking was quietly but irreversibly developing. And then the autumn of 1536 brought the north of England to a point of crisis that would test everything and everyone in it. The uprising that came to be called the Pilgrimage of Grace was the most significant popular rebellion in the England of Henry VIII, a vast movement that drew together, across the counties of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Lancashire and beyond, tens of thousands of ordinary people united by a shared and genuine fury at what was being done to their world. The dissolution of the monasteries was the most visible and most immediately painful of the grievances, but the complaints ran deeper. The new religious practices being imposed on communities that had not asked for them. The men who were enforcing those changes, Cromwell above all, who were widely despised as low-born upstarts without proper respect for the traditions they were dismantling. the general sense that the North was being governed by people in London who did not understand or care about the realities of Northern life. The rebels organized themselves with surprising efficiency, marching under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ and presenting their demands in the form of formal petitions that maintained carefully the language of loyal subjects seeking justice from a just king rather than rebels seeking to overthrow him. At its height, the pilgrimage mobilized somewhere in the region of 40,000 men. It was a force that temporarily dwarfed anything the crown could quickly assemble in the north, and Henry VIII, genuinely alarmed, though he would never have admitted it, played for time, promising to consider the rebels' grievances while positioning his forces to deal with any resumption of hostilities. For Lord Latimer, the crisis was agonizing and immediately personal. He was a great northern lord with known traditional sympathies. He was exactly the kind of man the rebels needed, someone of genuine standing whose participation would give their movement legitimacy and whose name would carry weight with the other gentry and nobles who were deciding which way to lean, and they were not content to simply invite him. They came to Snape Castle in the late autumn of 1536. They came in force, an armed crowd, purposeful and angry, certain of the righteousness of their cause. Lord Latimer was in London when they arrived, attending to the business that kept the men of the governing class in constant movement between their estates and the capital. Catherine was at Snape with her stepchildren, John and Margaret Neville, the son and daughter who looked to her as their mother and who depended on her to keep the world as safe and as stable as she could manage it. The rebels made their demands clearly. They wanted Lord Latimer's public support for their cause. They wanted him to ride with them, and until they had his commitment, his wife and his children would be their guarantee. The castle was breached. The household was overrun. Catherine and the children were held. Lord Latimer, receiving desperate word of what was happening at home, wrote to the King's Council with the raw fear of a man whose family was at stake. If I do not please them, I do not know what they will do with my body and goods, my wife and children. I beg to know the king's pleasure. He rushed home. Whatever assurances he made in the immediate crisis resolved the first siege, and the rebels, for the time being, dispersed. But the resolution did not hold. In January of 1537, after Lord Latimer had gone south again to appear at court and demonstrate his loyalty to the king, an act that the remaining rebels interpreted as treachery, they came back. A second siege of Snape Castle, another confrontation. Catherine and the children taken hostage for a second time. The castle violated and disturbed. The family's sense of safety and settled routine shattered again in the depths of a Yorkshire winter. How Catherine managed these weeks, the practical thinking she must have done about how to keep 2 children calm and safe, the steady composure she must have maintained in the face of circumstances that offered every reason for panic, the way she talked to the people around her and to herself in the hours when the situation was most uncertain. None of this is preserved in detail. What is preserved is the outcome. She came through. She was not harmed. The children were not harmed. The castle was damaged and disturbed, but the household survived intact. Henry VIII, once the pilgrimage had been decisively crushed and the rebel leaders executed, turned a searching eye on all those who had been involved, voluntarily or otherwise. The distinction between coerced participation and genuine sympathy was important, but difficult to prove in every case, and the aftermath of the rebellion was a period of anxiety for any northern lord whose conduct could be questioned. Lord Latimer spent much of 1537 and 1538 at court in London, carefully reconstructing his credentials as a loyal subject, demonstrating through attendance and deference and the patient accumulation of small acts of royal service that he was a man whose loyalty could be relied upon. Catherine managed his absences and his estates and his children and his household with the same quiet effectiveness she brought to everything else. And she was, through all of it, reading and thinking and developing into someone whose inner life was quietly but decisively becoming different from the person she had been when she arrived at Snape as a 21-year-old widow. The reformist texts that were circulating through educated households in the 1530s and early 40s were finding their way into Catherine's hands. The English Bible, which had been made available in the mid-1530s following years of legal and political struggle, was now present in churches and in the households of those who could afford it. And Catherine could afford it. She read it. She engaged with the arguments that the Reformation was pressing on anyone willing to think carefully about the questions it raised. What was the proper relationship between a Christian and God? Was the elaborate machinery of the Catholic Church, its priests, its sacraments, its saints, its indulgences, truly necessary for salvation, or had it grown into a barrier between the individual soul and the direct experience of grace? What did Scripture actually say when it was read in English, without the mediating layer of a Latin-educated clergy explaining what it meant? These were not comfortable questions for a woman living in a household led by a man of conservative Catholic sympathies, but they were questions Catherine could not stop asking, and the honest engagement with them that her reading and thinking demanded was gradually and then decisively shifting her toward the Reformed faith that would define the second half of her life. Lord Latimer's health declined through the early 1540s. He had never been physically robust, and the years of anxiety following the pilgrimage of grace, the constant necessity of demonstrating loyalty, the time spent at court away from his own home, the underlying stress of having navigated a political crisis that could have gone much worse, had worn on him. Catherine nursed him with the patient care she had always given to those placed in her charge, managing his illness with the practical medical knowledge she had accumulated through years of household responsibility. She sat with him through his pain. She managed the household around him. She was, in every practical sense, the person holding his world together as his grip on it loosened. He died on the 2nd of March, 1543. Catherine was with him in their London residence when the year's end came. He left her well provided for in his will, lands, income, and the guardianship of his daughter Margaret, entrusted to a woman he had known for 9 years, and whose capability and character he trusted without reservation. She was 30 years old. She had been widowed twice. She was childless across 2 marriages, despite 9 years with Lord Latimer. She was educated, composed, experienced in governance and household management, and financially independent. Her dower settlement from Lord Latimer's estate gave her real resources and real options. She was free, or as free as a woman in Tudor England could be, to make choices about what came next. But there was a complication, a significant one. Catherine Parr, in the spring of 1543, was in love with someone. His name was Thomas Seymour, and what she felt for him was not the quiet, warm regard of a woman who had learned to appreciate a man over time. It was something she had been carrying for years, something she had been setting aside while duty required it, and while her second husband lived. It was the love she had wanted to act on, and had been prevented from acting on, and that was waiting for her now, in the moment when she had finally become free enough to choose. And then the King of England chose for her. The north of England that Catherine entered when she married Lord Latimer was a world with its own particular character and its own ways of understanding the relationship between a community and its past. The great abbeys and priories that studied the Yorkshire landscape, Fountains, Rievaulx, Bolton, Whitby, Jervaux, were not merely religious institutions. They were the social infrastructure of a region that had relatively few of the civic and commercial institutions that the southern counties had developed. They provided employment for hundreds of local people, charity to the poor of the surrounding communities, hospitality to travellers and pilgrims, education to the children of families who could not otherwise have accessed it, and the spiritual rhythm that organised the agricultural year around the great feasts and fasts of the church's calendar. When Thomas Cromwell's commissioners arrived in the 1530s and began the work of dissolution, surveying the properties, assessing the value of the assets, preparing the documentation that would allow the Crown to take possession. They were dismantling, community by community, the social fabric of a society that had no ready alternative to put in its place. The anger this produced was not merely sentimental or theologically conservative. It was practical. It was the anger of people who could see, in specific and concrete terms, what they were losing, which monks had run a school for local children, which abbey had maintained the bridge on the road to market, which priory had distributed food to the poor in the months when the harvest had been insufficient. The pilgrimage of grace was, among other things, the organised expression of that anger, and the north of England was united in it with a solidarity that crossed the usual divisions of class and social position. Lord Latimer's position in this world was complicated and ultimately untenable. He was a man of genuine personal religious conservatism, who occupied a seat of governance in a region that was rising in rebellion against the government he represented. He could not participate openly in the rebellion without committing treason. He could not stand publicly against it without alienating himself from the society in which he had to live and govern. The letters he wrote to the King's Council during the crisis of 1536, pleading for guidance, explaining the impossible pressure he was under, are the letters of a man trying desperately to find a path between two equally dangerous positions and knowing that neither will serve him completely. Catherine's experience of the pilgrimage of grace, the 2 sieges, the hostage-taking, the management of her stepchildren through genuine physical danger, needs to be understood in this context of total communal disruption. Snape Castle was not simply a family home that happened to be attacked by strangers. It was a seat of local governance in a society that was in the process of tearing itself apart over questions of faith and power and economic survival. The people who surrounded it were not an undifferentiated mob. They were neighbours, tenants, people who had lived in the same valley for generations and who were now asking, with weapons in their hands, whether Lord Latimer was with them or against them. The personal danger was real, but the social meaning of the situation, the breakdown of the ordinary structures of authority and mutual obligation that made life in a community possible, was perhaps equally frightening in its own way. Catherine managed through it, and the experience left its mark on her in ways that are visible in her subsequent life. She had discovered, in circumstances that offered no preparation and no guide, that she was capable of keeping her composure when everything around her was composed only of chaos. She had discovered that the steady management of practical necessity, the daily questions of what to eat, where to sleep, how to keep children calm, what to say to frightened people, was something she could do even when the larger context of her life was entirely beyond her control. This was knowledge about herself that could not have been acquired in any gentler way, and it served her for the rest of her life. The religious development that was quietly proceeding through these years of the second marriage is also worth examining more closely. Catherine's movement toward the Reformed faith was not, we should be clear, a sudden conversion or a single transformative event. It was a gradual process, shaped by reading and conversation, and the quiet accumulation of conviction that comes from thinking seriously about questions that genuinely matter to one. The texts that were circulating in educated households in the 1530s were enormously various in their theological character. Some were orthodox, some were reformist, some were ambiguously positioned between old and new in ways that made them attractive to people who were not yet ready to commit fully to a particular position. Catherine moved through this landscape of ideas with the careful attention of someone who was reading for genuine understanding rather than for the performance of learning. The English Bible was perhaps the single most important of the reformist developments she would have encountered. The ability to read the scriptures in one's own language, to encounter the words of the Gospels and the epistles directly, without the mediation of a priest who translated and interpreted and applied, was transformative for people who had previously known the Bible only through the summarized liturgy of the Mass and the homilies of parish clergy. For Catherine, with her excellent Latin, this was not a matter of accessing the content of Scripture for the first time. She had been able to read it in Latin all along, but the English translation made it possible to think about the meaning of specific passages in the language of daily thought, rather than the language of formal study. And that shift opened up new possibilities for personal engagement and personal application. The conversations that took place in the Queen's household that Catherine Parr would eventually lead grew directly out of the conversations that were taking place in educated northern households during these years. The reading and discussion of reformist texts, the comparing of different positions, the careful working through of what one actually believed when the question was examined honestly. Catherine arrived at her queenship not as a recent or superficial convert, but as a woman who had been thinking seriously about the questions of faith for a decade or more, who had read widely in the reformist literature, and who held her Protestant convictions with the depth and confidence of someone who had arrived at them through genuine intellectual work. Thomas Seymour was, in the spring and early summer of 1543, a man at the centre of a court that was about to change dramatically. He was the younger brother of Jane Seymour, the third of Henry's wives, the woman who had given the king his longed-for male heir, and who had died in childbed in 1537, leaving Henry in the unusual position of genuinely grieving a wife he had loved and hadn't had to remove by force or coercion. That grief had placed the Seymour family in a position of considerable influence. The elder brother, Edward Seymour, was among the most powerful men in the kingdom, uncle to the heir, close to the king's council, positioned to dominate whatever regency arrangement would eventually be needed to govern England during Prince Edward's minority. Thomas occupied a different kind of position, less burdened by the heavy administrative work of his brother, freer in his movements and his personal life, living more fully in the present of a court that offered a man of his gifts and energy considerable enjoyment. He was charming in the direct, vigorous way of men who had grown up comfortable with attention and who had found that it rarely needed to be sought. He was well-travelled, having spent time on diplomatic assignments in France and on the continent, and the ease with which he moved through great courts spoke of someone who had been educated by experience in the widest possible school. He was ambitious, though in 1543 his ambitions were still taking shape, more energy and intention than specific program, more restlessness than plan. He was probably attractive in the physical way of men who have never lacked for companionship and who carry themselves accordingly. He and Catherine Parr had found each other through whatever combination of shared interest and mutual recognition that the word finding implies, sometime in the years before Lord Latimer's death. The relationship had grown into something serious, something that, by the time Lord Latimer was dying, had the character of a settled intention rather than a casual attachment. In a letter Catherine wrote to Seymour after Henry VIII's death, a letter in which she could finally be direct about what she had suppressed for so long, she told him, "My mind was fully bent to marry you before any man I knew." She had wanted him. She had expected him. She had been prepared, as Lord Latimer's life drew to its close, to begin a new chapter of her own life that would finally include the person she had chosen for herself. And then the most powerful man in England made his interest known. Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, had been executed in February of 1542, a girl barely out of childhood, accused of sexual impropriety before her marriage and treason within it, paying with her life for a combination of genuine past indiscretion and the merciless political calculations of a court that had used her youth and her vulnerability and then discarded her when she became inconvenient. Her execution had left Henry in a particular kind of devastated state, not simply the grief of loss, but the wounded pride of a man who believed he had been publicly made a fool of, who had invested feeling in a young woman who, he was told, had been less than honest with him, and who could not easily separate his grief from his rage or his need for sympathy, from his impulse toward destruction. By the summer of 1543, a year and a half after Catherine Howard's death, Henry was not a young man by any standard. He was 51 years old. He was enormously heavy. The vigorous young king of his early reign, who had jousted and danced and hunted and demonstrated the physical exuberance of a man at the height of his powers, was long gone. The leg wound he had sustained in a jousting accident in 1536 had ulcerated and never properly healed, and the constant pain it caused him, combined with the immobility it forced on him, had contributed to a weight gain that was now very visible and increasingly debilitating. His moods were governed to a significant degree by the pain in his leg. When it was at its worst, he was at his darkest and his most dangerously irrational. When it eased, something of the charm and intelligence of the earlier king could still be glimpsed. He wanted a wife. Both personal and political reasons drove this desire. He was a man who had defined himself through marriage and family for his entire adult life. A king without a queen was a king whose household was incomplete, whose court lacked its feminine center, whose children lacked the kind of settled maternal figure that could make their complex and uncertain positions slightly more manageable. The question of who would become the sixth Queen of England was therefore a matter of very real consequence, and considerable personal risk for any woman who attracted his notice. What drew Henry's attention to Catherine Parr is not preserved in any dramatic recorded moment of recognition. She had been moving in court circles through her connection to Princess Mary's household, and in those circles she would have been visible. A woman of good family, clearly educated, composed and intelligent in the way of someone who had lived through real difficulty and not been diminished by it. She was not young in the way of Catherine Howard. She was 31, experienced, a widow twice over. But she was handsome, and there was an attractiveness in her steady composure and her evident capability that was different from the appeal of youth, and would perhaps wear better for a man who had had enough of the dangers that youth and inexperience could bring. Henry's interest was communicated through the channels that court protocol provided for such things. The proposal was, in practical terms, unanswerable. The social and political machinery of the Tudor court did not make room for a woman of Catherine's position to refuse the King of England without consequences that would extend far beyond her own inconvenience. The refusal was not available to her. And yet, the choice she faced was not simply between accepting and refusing. It was a choice about how she would understand and position herself in relation to a role that had been catastrophic for most of the women who had held it. The ghost of Catherine Howard was not yet 2 years old. The ghost of Anne Boleyn was 7. Catherine knew exactly what becoming Henry VIII's queen had meant for her predecessors. She was not entering this with any illusions. The tradition that has come down to us, plausible and consistent with everything we know of Catherine's character and her deep Protestant faith, is that she experienced her acceptance of Henry's proposal as something more than resignation to the inevitable. She came to believe, through prayer and through the working out of her conscience, that this was a calling, that the God she trusted was placing this particular and very difficult charge in her path for a reason, that she had the specific combination of qualities required to do it well, that there was genuine good she could accomplish from this position that could not be accomplished from anywhere else, and that the faith she held obliged her to take up the challenge rather than seek the safer path. Whether this was a profound spiritual insight, a useful framework for accepting what she could not change, or both, we cannot say. What we can say is that it was not out of character. Catherine Parr was a woman who took her faith seriously, who believed that her life had a purpose, and who had long since demonstrated that she was capable of doing difficult things steadily and well. Thomas Seymour was sent away. Henry, who understood perfectly well the emotional landscape of the situation, and who had no intention of allowing a complication to develop in his own household, arranged for Seymour to take up a diplomatic mission on the continent, removing him from court before the wedding and eliminating the daily presence of a man who represented an alternative to what Catherine was being asked to accept. It was efficient and ruthless, and very much in Henry's manner. The wedding took place on the 12th of July, 1543. The setting was the Queen's closet at Hampton Court Palace, a small and intimate room in the private apartments, not the grand ceremonial hall or the chapel. The witnesses were few. The ceremony was quiet. This was the 6th marriage for Henry, an almost unimaginable accumulation of matrimonial history, and even by the standards of a court that had witnessed the full pageant of that history, there was very little spectacle to be had. Catherine Parr became Queen of England at the age of approximately 31. She brought to the position a combination of qualities that no previous wife of Henry had possessed in quite the same proportions. Catherine of Aragon had brought dignity and learning, and an unconquerable conviction of her own rightness, but also a rigidity that had made the deadlock of the divorce permanent and terrible. Anne Boleyn had brought brilliance and political intelligence and reformist religious conviction, along with an ambition and a sharp-edged personal style that had made powerful enemies and had ultimately proved fatal. Jane Seymour had brought gentleness and submission and the luck to die before the relationship could deteriorate. Anne of Cleves had brought nothing Henry wanted and had been efficiently set aside. Catherine Howard had brought youth and surface charm and a personal history that had destroyed her. None of them had brought quite what Catherine Parr brought, the specific and hard-won combination of genuine intellectual engagement, practical competence tested under genuine pressure, Protestant faith held with deep personal conviction, and the particular kind of patient strategic intelligence that comes from years of managing situations where the margin for error is very small and the consequences of failure are severe. She entered her marriage to Henry VIII with open eyes and set about carefully and thoughtfully the work of being queen. One of the first and most significant things Catherine accomplished as queen, accomplished through the quiet, daily work of relationship, rather than through any public act of authority, was the restoration of something like a family to Henry VIII's fractured household. When she arrived at court as queen in the summer of 1543, the royal children were not a family in any warm or functional sense. They were three people of widely differing ages and wildly differing political circumstances who shared a father and had very little else in common except the anxiety of their various uncertain positions. The Lady Mary, at 27 the eldest, had spent the better part of a decade in a kind of suspended political limbo. Her legitimacy questioned, her mother's marriage declared void, her own position alternating between grudging acknowledgement and deliberate exclusion. She was a woman of considerable dignity and stubborn faith, holding to the Catholicism that was her inheritance from her Spanish mother with a tenacity that would never leave her. Her relationship with her father was strained by the accumulated weight of everything that had happened, and her court life was marked by the careful management of a woman who understood that she existed, always, on sufferance. The Lady Elizabeth, 9 years old when her father married Catherine Parr, was in some ways in the most precarious position of all. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been beheaded, executed on charges that the courts had declared treasonous, but that history has generally regarded with deep skepticism. Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate. She had grown up in modest and sometimes uncomfortable circumstances, dependent on the goodwill of people around her, and acutely aware, even at her young age, that goodwill was a resource that could be withdrawn without notice. Prince Edward, 5 years old, was the precious male heir around whom so much of the court's anxiety rotated. He was a serious, intelligent, somewhat solemn little boy who had been surrounded since birth by the carefully managed nervousness of adults, who understood how much depended on his continued good health and whose anxiety sometimes expressed itself as a kind of oppressive attentiveness that gave the child very little room to simply be a child. Catherine changed the atmosphere of this household through the consistent daily work of genuine warmth. She was interested in all three children. Not performatively interested, not strategically interested, but genuinely curious about who they were and what they needed. With Mary, close to her own age, she developed a real friendship grounded in their shared connection through their mothers. Two women who had both moved in the orbit of Catherine of Aragon, and in the mutual respect of two intelligent women who found in each other genuine companionship. They exchanged books. They made music together. They wrote letters when apart. Mary, who had been lonely in ways she probably could not fully articulate, found in her new stepmother someone who treated her as an adult of full standing, rather than a political embarrassment to be managed. With Elizabeth, the relationship was perhaps the most consequential of all the human bonds Catherine ever formed. The 9-year-old princess who entered Catherine's world in the summer of 1543 was already demonstrating the extraordinary intellectual gifts that would define her. She was quick, curious, linguistically gifted, and hungry for exactly the kind of attention and intellectual engagement that Catherine was ideally placed to provide. Catherine recognized what she was looking at and responded to it fully. She organized Elizabeth's studies with care, eventually arranging for William Grindal, a scholar of real distinction from Cambridge, to serve as the prince's personal tutor. She drew Elizabeth into the intellectual life of her own household, sharing books and conversations and the kind of daily engagement with ideas that a curious and brilliant child requires to thrive. For the small Prince Edward, Catherine provided something simpler and perhaps more important. She was warm and she was steady, and she made it possible for a 5-year-old boy to feel something like safety in the shadow of an enormous and frightening father. The prince's letters from these years, the careful, formal compositions of a child being taught to write in the proper epistolary style of the age, are addressed to Catherine with genuine affection. He called her his dearest mother. He looked to her as the person who could translate the terrifying king into something more approachable, who could carry his messages and his small concerns to the man who held so much power over his life. Catherine's influence over the formal education of both Elizabeth and Edward was direct and shaped by her own reformist intellectual convictions. She advocated consistently for tutors trained in the humanist tradition of the continental Renaissance. Scholars who believed that children should be educated in the classical languages and the great texts of antiquity, that they should read broadly and think independently, and that the scriptures in the vernacular should be central to their formation. For Edward, she supported the appointment of the distinguished Cambridge scholar John Check, one of the finest teachers of his generation, as the prince's principal tutor. For Elizabeth, the engagement of Grindal provided the foundation of an education that would eventually make her one of the most learned monarchs in European history. Under these teachers, and in the atmosphere of warmth and intellectual encouragement that Catherine created around them, both Edward and Elizabeth flourished in ways that their earlier, more anxious circumstances had not always permitted. Catherine's practical influence on the succession was also significant. Through patient, persistent advocacy, through keeping Henry's daughters in his daily life, reminding him of their worth and their need for recognition, and working on his instincts as a father at those moments when he was most accessible to such appeals. She helped bring about the Third Act of Succession in 1544. This act restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of inheritance, placing them behind their brother Edward, but making them once again legitimate heirs to the crown. It was a measure of enormous consequence. Without it, neither woman would have had the legal foundation to claim the throne when their turns came. Catherine Parr helped to make both the Catholic restoration of Mary's reign and the long era of Elizabeth's rule legally possible, a contribution to English history that deserves to sit at the centre of any assessment of her legacy. The year 1544 brought her a different kind of responsibility. In July, Henry VIII departed for France on the military campaign that would prove to be his last, the Siege of Boulogne. Before he left, he appointed Catherine Parr Queen Regent of England for the duration of his absence. This was not a titular appointment. It carried real authority and real demands. Catherine attended meetings of the council. She signed 5 royal proclamations during the months of the regency, each one bearing her signature as the authorizing power. She managed the financial and logistical work of supporting Henry's army across the Channel, the organization of additional musters, the provision of funds, the complex coordination required to keep a military campaign in the field, while ensuring that the kingdoms supporting it continued to function. She kept in close communication with the Earl of Shrewsbury, Henry's lieutenant in the north, over the perpetually complex situation on the Scottish border, which required careful watching and active management when England's primary military strength was committed to France. She did all of this with an efficiency and a composure that those who worked with her noted and valued. She was not a regent performing unfamiliar duties under duress. She was a woman who understood how governance worked, who had been managing complex situations with limited resources for her entire adult life, and who brought to this larger stage the same qualities she had always brought to smaller ones. In those same months of 1544, she also produced the first of her published works. Psalms or prayers appeared anonymously. A translation of Latin prayers attributed to the reformist Bishop John Fisher, published without its author's name on the title page. It was a cautious beginning, feeling the temperature of public response before committing to the fuller exposure of identified authorship. The following year, the fuller commitment was made. On the 8th of June, 1545, a book titled Prayers or Meditations appeared in the bookshops of London. It was 60 pages of vernacular devotional prayers, warm and personal in their tone, rooted in real theological feeling, written in the accessible English of a woman who wanted ordinary readers to find in them something useful for their own spiritual lives. And it carried, on its title page, the name of the woman who had written it, Catherine the Queen. This was historic. In the 60 years since printing had come to England, no woman had published an original work in English under her own name. Books by women had appeared, but always anonymously, always attributed to male editors or patrons, always hidden behind the conventions that made female intellectual production socially invisible. Catherine Parr changed this. She placed her name on her work openly and formally, and in doing so, she established a precedent that all subsequent women writers in English would build upon. She was not simply publishing a devotional book. She was making a claim about what a woman could do and be willing to be known for. The book was read widely and appreciated genuinely. Multiple editions appeared in rapid succession, and it generated one of the most beautiful gestures in the record of Catherine's life. Her stepdaughter Elizabeth, 13 years old, eager to demonstrate both her love and her abilities, translated prayers or meditations into Latin, French, and Italian, all 3 languages. She presented the 3 translations to her father Henry as a New Year's gift. Bound in a cover, she had embroidered herself with flowers and careful needlework. The gift was a demonstration of the princess's extraordinary learning, a tribute to the woman who had shaped and encouraged that learning, and an act of genuine affection expressed in the formal language of Tudor gift-giving. In the autumn of 1546, Catherine was completing a more ambitious and more deeply personal piece of writing. The Lamentation of a Sinner was her own theological autobiography, a text in which she traced in her own voice her spiritual journey from what she understood as the error of the old religion to the liberating truth of the Reformed gospel. She wrote in the first person, using her own experience as the narrative through which universal spiritual truths could be examined. She identified herself explicitly as Queen of England. She wrote with a directness and a personal transparency that was entirely new in English religious writing. It was a bold piece of work, composed during a period of genuine and active personal danger, which makes its courage all the more striking. It was not published until after Henry's death, in November of 1547, when the political climate had changed enough to make its frank Protestant content less immediately dangerous. When it appeared, it was the first conversion narrative in English, another literary first for a woman who had already established herself as a pioneer. Through all of this intellectual and literary activity, Catherine was simultaneously managing the day-to-day reality of life beside an aging, increasingly ill, and sometimes dangerously unpredictable king. She read Henry carefully, understood the patterns of his moods, knew when he was accessible and when he was not, could judge when a theological discussion would give him pleasure and when the same discussion would irritate him past his limited patience. She engaged him in conversations that played to his genuine intelligence. She nursed his leg, sat with him through his pain, and provided the steady domestic warmth that the court around him was too anxious and too political to provide. She had also gathered around her in the Queen's household a circle of educated Protestant women whose shared beliefs and shared reading created something very close to a small intellectual community at the heart of the court. Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk, outspoken, brilliant, one of the most committed Protestant noblewomen in England, Lady Denny and Lady Herbert, her own sister Anne. In these apartments, books circulated, scripture was read and discussed, and the new ideas of the Reformation were examined with a seriousness and a personal engagement that nowhere else in Henry's court was readily available. It was this circle, and what it represented, that certain men at court would eventually try to use against her. The court that Catherine Parr entered as queen in the summer of 1543 was a place that had been shaped by 34 years of Henry VIII's rule, 34 years in which the king's personality, his needs, his fears, and his desires had pressed themselves onto every aspect of its life, from the architecture of its buildings, to the rituals of its daily routines, to the nervous dispositions of the people who lived and worked within it. It was a court of genuine cultural distinction. Music and learning and fine art were present in abundance, as they had always been. But it was also a court that had been marked by the violence of the preceding 2 decades in ways that were written in the faces and the bearing of almost everyone who had survived them. The executions of Anne Boleyn and Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, the humiliation of Catherine of Aragon, the beheading of Catherine Howard. These events had not passed without leaving their impressions on the people who had witnessed them, and those impressions showed in the careful, watchful, slightly flinching quality of the court's social life, in the way that people spoke their real opinions very quietly and only to those they trusted absolutely, in the habit of managing one's expression that was so deeply ingrained that it had become indistinguishable from natural demeanour. Catherine Parr had to manage Henry VIII daily and over years. She had been prepared for difficult management by every previous marriage and every previous challenge, by the political delicacy of navigating the aftermath of the pilgrimage of grace, by the patience required to nurse a declining man through a long illness, by the practice of keeping her own counsel while maintaining her warmth. But managing Henry was a different order of difficulty from anything she had previously encountered, and it is worth trying to understand what it actually required of her. Henry's moods were governed by his pain. When his ulcerated leg was at its worst, which it was for increasing periods as the years of the 1540s progressed, he became a different person from the one who, on his better days, was capable of genuine charm and real intellectual engagement. On the bad days, he was short-tempered, suspicious, and liable to interpret any perceived slight or any difference of opinion as a form of treachery. He was surrounded by people who had learned, through hard experience, to give him whatever he seemed to want in the moment, to agree with his most recent opinion, to find reasons to praise rather than to question. The problem with this approach was that it left Henry increasingly isolated in his own convictions, increasingly unable to distinguish between loyal counsel and mere flattery, increasingly likely to make decisions based on his worst rather than his best instincts. Catherine navigated this environment with a skill that had no single secret. She was genuinely warm with him. She cared about his comfort, tended his leg, sat with him through his pain with the patience of someone who had been doing this kind of nursing for years. She engaged his real intelligence. He was capable of genuine thought, and the theological and literary discussions they had gave him something to work with, some use for the formidable mind that his body was increasingly trapping in a declining physical prison. She was honest with him in the ways she could be honest, and careful in the ways that carefulness was required. She did not tell him everything she thought, but she did not tell him things she did not believe. And in a court where most people simply told the king whatever he appeared to want to hear, this distinction was noticed and valued. She also managed his relationships with his children in ways that were genuinely beneficial to all parties. When Henry was well enough to be warmed by the sight of his children's progress, Catherine made sure they were present and visible, that Edward's latest achievement in Latin was brought to his father's attention, that Elizabeth's translation was ready at the right moment, that Mary's affectionate regard for her father was expressed in ways that Henry could receive without the complicated feelings that the history of their estrangement sometimes provoked. She was, in effect, the translator between a father who was enormous and frightening, and a set of children who needed his affection and approval, offering each side to the other in the form most likely to produce a good outcome. The circle she gathered in the Queen's household deserves fuller attention than it often receives. The women who gathered around Catherine Parr in the Queen's apartments were not simply social companions or religious fellow travellers. They were, in several cases, women of real intellectual and personal consequence. Figures whose lives and contributions to the English Reformation had significance in their own right. Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk, was perhaps the most remarkable of them. She had been born Catherine Willoughby, a ward of the Duke of Suffolk, and had married Charles Brandon, the Duke himself, Henry VIII's great friend and brother-in-law, when she was 14 and he was 49. Brandon died in 1545, leaving Catherine Willoughby one of the wealthiest and most independent noblewomen in England. She was outspoken in her Protestant convictions in a way that occasionally alarmed even those who shared them, and she was willing to use her wealth and position in active support of reformist causes and individuals. She and Catherine Parr were genuine friends, not merely allies. Two women of strong convictions who found in each other a companionship grounded in shared intellectual and spiritual life. Lady Anne Herbert, Catherine's own sister, was another important figure in the Queen's circle. Anne had married William Herbert, who would be created Earl of Pembroke, and she moved between the Queen's household and her own, with the ease of someone whose family connection to the Queen gave her both access and trust. Lady Denny, wife of Sir Anthony Denny, one of Henry's most trusted personal attendants, was also part of the circle, a woman whose household at Cheshunt would later provide shelter for Elizabeth when she needed to leave Chelsea Manor. These women read together. They read the reformist texts that were circulating in educated households, texts that were often technically illegal under the Heresy statutes, but that were widely available to those who knew where to find them. They discussed scripture. They examined the theological questions that the Reformation was pressing on everyone who paid attention to them. They were not simply a devotional reading group. They were a community of intellectual women using the protection of the Queen's household to engage with ideas that the official church found dangerous, and their discussions influenced each other's thinking in ways that went well beyond the informal. It was the visibility of this activity, the known character of the Queen's household as a space of reformist religious life that gave Gardiner and Wriothesley their opportunity when they went looking for one. They were not manufacturing a concern from nothing. The concern was real and had real substance. What they were doing was trying to exploit it for political purposes, to use the genuine reformist character of the Queen's circle as the basis for a legal attack that would remove the Queen herself from the board. The Regency of 1544 also deserves more careful attention than it usually receives in accounts of Catherine's queenship. The standard narrative acknowledges that she served as regent and leaves it there, as though the fact of the appointment were more significant than what the appointment required her to do. But the practical demands of governing a kingdom during a military campaign are considerable, and the summer of 1544 placed those demands before Catherine in very specific and concrete forms. The financial dimension alone was complex. Henry's Boulogne campaign required money, significant money, mobilized quickly and continuously, channeled through the administrative machinery of the kingdom and across the channel to the army in the field. Catherine oversaw the council's work of managing these flows. She corresponded with the king's officers on matters of supply and muster. She handled the complex administrative relationship with the Scottish border, a relationship that was never simple in any period of English history, and that was particularly fraught when England's main military strength was committed elsewhere. She maintained the function of the royal household and the dignity of the crown during the king's absence. She was, for those months, England's effective head of government. That she returned this governance to Henry when he came back from France without incident or complaint, without seeking to convert the experience into any permanent claim on political authority, tells us something important about how she understood her role. She was not operating as a political actor seeking advancement for herself. She was serving the crown, the kingdom, and the king, doing what the situation required as competently as she could manage it, and then stepping back when the situation changed. This is not passivity. It is a particular form of political intelligence, understanding that the accumulation of formal power is not always the best way to accumulate real influence, and that the patient, continuous exercise of genuine service is sometimes more consequential in the long run. The man who moved against Catherine Parr in the spring and summer of 1546 was Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, one of the most formidable figures in the English Church, and one of the most skilled political operators in a court that was full of skilled political operators. He was intelligent, conservative in his theology, deeply committed to maintaining as much of the traditional Catholic structure of the Church as the king's break with Rome had left standing, and entirely comfortable with the use of legal and institutional power against people he considered dangerous. He had survived every storm of Henry's reign through a combination of genuine ability, flexible loyalty, and the careful management of his own exposure. He was not a man who moved against enemies without calculating his chances carefully in advance. His partner was Thomas Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor, another conservative figure who shared Gardiner's discomfort with the direction the English Reformation was taking under the influence of the Queen and her circle, and who was willing to provide the legal machinery necessary to pursue the case. Their strategy was indirect and careful, a direct attack on Catherine herself, presenting evidence of heresy against the Queen to the King, who was known to be fond of her, would have required them to be very confident of Henry's cooperation from the outset, which they could not be. Instead, they went after the women around her. Catherine's household was known for its reformist sympathies and its reformist reading. If they could demonstrate that ladies of the Queen's household held views that fell under the statutory definition of heresy, they could begin building a case that moved from those women toward the Queen herself, establishing a chain of connection that would eventually make Catherine's position untenable, regardless of Henry's personal affection for her. The instrument they found was Anne Askew, a Protestant of absolute and unwavering conviction, a woman who had been preaching and arguing for the Reformed faith in London and elsewhere with a visibility that had already brought her into conflict with the authorities. In 1545, she had been arrested for the first time on charges relating to her denial of the Catholic doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. She had been released after what appears to have been a partial recantation made under duress. In 1546, she was arrested again, and this time her interrogators had a specific purpose in mind. They wanted her to name the women in the Queen's household who had supported and encouraged her. Askew refused. She was examined by Gardiner himself. She was questioned by Wriothesley. She was pressed for the names of her supporters in the court: the Duchess of Suffolk, Lady Herbert, Lady Denny, the women whose reformist beliefs were well enough known to make them plausible targets. She refused. She sat, by her own account, for 2 long hours on the bare floor arguing with the Lord Chancellor, declining every offer and resisting every threat, while maintaining with absolute consistency that she had nothing to tell them. The interrogators moved to torture. They used the rack, the instrument that stretched the body by tying the wrists and ankles and pulling against the natural movement of the joints until something gave way. This was illegal under English law in the case of a woman, and the violation of that legal boundary in order to break Anne Askew speaks to the desperation of the men pursuing her, and to how much they believed the names she was refusing to give them were worth. The rack left her permanently and severely damaged. Her joints were dislocated. Her body was torn in the ways that would not heal. She had to be carried to the place of her execution because she could not walk. She named no one. Through everything, the interrogation, the threats, the physical destruction of her body, she gave them nothing that could be used against the women who depended on her silence. On the 16th of July, 1546, Anne Askew was carried to Smithfield in a chair because she could no longer support her own weight, tied to the stake and burned alive. She was one of the last Protestant martyrs of Henry VIII's reign. She had died to protect Catherine Parr and the other women of her circle. Gardiner did not give up. He had gathered enough circumstantial material, the known character of the religious discussions in the Queen's apartments, reports of suspect books, the general atmosphere of Protestant activity among the Queen's ladies, to approach Henry with a carefully framed presentation of his concerns. He waited for his moment, and Henry gave it to him. Catherine had engaged Henry in a theological discussion on one of the days when his leg was at its worst, and his tolerance was at its lowest. Whatever the content of the discussion, Henry found her persistence in the argument irritating rather than stimulating, and he complained, within Gardiner's hearing, that it was a strange thing for a man to be lectured on theology by his own wife. Gardiner was ready for exactly this opening. He suggested that the king would be astonished at what a proper investigation of the Queen's household would reveal. He offered to conduct such an investigation. Henry, in his pain and his irritation, authorized it. A warrant was drawn up. It authorized the arrest and examination of Catherine Parr on charges of heresy, charges that, if prosecuted, would take her to the Tower of London, and from the Tower to the well-worn path that 2 of her predecessors had already walked to the block. Henry signed it, and then, through a sequence of events that John Fox describes but that cannot be fully verified, the existence of the warrant became known to someone in the royal household who understood what it meant and who carried the warning to Catherine. The response Catherine made to this knowledge is the most remarkable single act of her remarkable life. She did not run. She did not appeal through servants or intermediaries. She did not attempt to destroy evidence or hide herself behind the social machinery of queenly dignity. She went to Henry that same night. She went to his apartments where he was suffering and in pain, and she sat beside him and she began to speak. She told him that she had argued with him about theology not because she believed herself wiser than him. God forbid, she said, that she should be so vain, but because she had sought to benefit from his great learning, and beyond that, because she had hoped that the engagement of his remarkable mind in lively debate might give him some relief from the pain of his leg, which she knew was severe and which she found heartbreaking to witness. She had not sought to correct him. She had sought to distract him from his suffering and to take, in passing, whatever she could learn from the encounter. She was his pupil. He was the master. She had only wanted to serve him as best she could. Whether this was entirely true is less important than whether it was entirely believable. Henry VIII was a man of genuine intelligence and genuine vanity, a combination that made the argument Catherine was making exactly as effective as it needed to be. She had framed what could be construed as intellectual presumption as an act of devotion and care. She had not argued with him because she thought herself his equal. She had done it because she loved him and wanted to ease his pain. The narrative was perfect, perfect for Henry, perfect for the moment, perfect in the way that only a very precise and very deep understanding of the person being addressed can produce. "And is that so, sweetheart?" Henry said. He drew her to him. The arrest was cancelled. The following morning, Lord Chancellor Wriothesley arrived in the royal gardens with 40 soldiers, apparently unaware that the situation had changed and intending to proceed with the Queen's arrest. Henry confronted him in person, called him a beast and a knave before the court, dismissed him and his soldiers with an anger that may have been genuine royal outrage or may have been a deliberate performance of the protection he was extending to his wife. Either way, the message was unmistakable, and the plot was over. Catherine drew back, in the aftermath of this crisis, from some of the more visibly reformist activities of her household. She was more careful about the books that circulated among her ladies. She was more restrained in the discussions that took place in the Queen's apartments. She continued to believe what she believed. She continued privately to write. But she had seen, with complete clarity, exactly how close the margin was, and she was not a woman who needed to see such a thing twice. The remaining months of Henry VIII's life passed without another direct confrontation. His health was declining with visible speed. He withdrew increasingly into a smaller and smaller circle of attendants. He was in constant pain. The great political arrangements of the succession were being made around him, and to some degree without him, shaped by the men who would govern after him and who were positioning themselves for that governance with the calculating attention of people who had been watching and waiting for a long time. Catherine nursed Henry through his final decline with the same patient care she had given to every person placed in her charge throughout her life. She sat with him, she tended him, she was present. And on the 28th of January, 1547, in the early hours of the morning at Whitehall Palace, Henry VIII died. He was 55 years old. He had been King of England for 37 years. He had been married 6 times, and the last of those 6 wives was free. The days following Henry VIII's death were days of political movement of extraordinary speed. The council, that had been assembled in the final months of Henry's life to govern England during his son's minority was dominated from the outset by Edward Seymour, the new king's uncle, who moved immediately to consolidate his position and who emerged within days as Lord Protector of England, effectively the regent for the 9-year-old Edward VI. The formal council of 16 members included the men who had spent Henry's final years positioning themselves for exactly this moment. It did not include Catherine Parr. She had expected otherwise. She had reason to expect otherwise. She had been Queen Regent. She had governed. She had managed the council in Henry's absence from England, had signed proclamations and handled finances and maintained order, and had done all of this competently and without creating any of the problems that the men around her had occasionally given her reason to anticipate. She had been the mother, in every practical sense, of the boy who was now king. She had shaped his education, managed his household, been the warm human constant of his childhood. She had reason to believe that her relationship with Edward VI and her demonstrated capacity for governance would translate into some formal role in the regency. Instead, the council excluded her. She was given the financial settlements due to a Queen Dowager, and they were generous settlements, making her one of the wealthiest women in England, and she was given the appropriate ceremonial dignities of her title. But she was given no seat at the council table, no formal voice in the governance of the kingdom, no official standing in the minority government. After everything she had done, she was to be maintained in comfortable dignity and kept out of the way. The exclusion was painful in ways that the record does not directly preserve, but that are not difficult to imagine. It was also, in the way of such political arrangements, largely irreversible. The men of the Regency Council had made their calculations, and Catherine's position in the new order of things was not going to be renegotiated through appeals or protests. But there was something waiting for her, something she had wanted for a very long time. Thomas Seymour was back. He had returned to court before Henry's death, having spent the years of Catherine's queenship on the continent or at the margins of court life. His brother Edward's elevation to Lord Protector placed Thomas in a curious and somewhat uncomfortable position. Well-connected, significant, close to the centre of a new power arrangement, but not himself at the centre of it. He was a man of enormous restless energy and considerable personal magnetism, and the position of younger brother to the regent offered neither the scope nor the satisfaction that his temperament required. He and Catherine moved toward each other with the speed of people who had been waiting a very long time. In April or May of 1547, just a few months after Henry's death, they married in secret. The secrecy was deliberate and entirely necessary. A Queen Dowager remarrying within months of her husband's death would attract fierce criticism regardless of whom she married. The fact that the bridegroom was the brother of the Lord Protector and had not obtained the council's formal permission added several additional layers of political complication. The secret was kept for several months before public knowledge became unavoidable, and when the marriage was acknowledged, the reactions were as predictable as they were unpleasant. Scandal at the speed, accusations of calculation on Seymour's part, suggestions that the Queen's dignity had been poorly served. The love was genuine. Catherine's own words confirm it beyond any reasonable doubt. In a letter she wrote to Seymour during this period, warm and direct and entirely free of the careful management that had characterized all her public expression for years, she wrote that she had always wanted him before any other man she had known, and that she had been patient for a very long time. That patience had finally been rewarded. They settled at Chelsea Manor, the Thameside property, that had been part of Catherine's generous dower settlement from Henry's estate. The house was beautiful, surrounded by gardens that ran down to the river, positioned in the pleasant landscape between London and the countryside. Elizabeth came to live with them, continuing the relationship with her stepmother that had been one of the most sustaining presences of her young life. Lady Jane Grey, Thomas Seymour's ward, a serious and remarkably learned girl of about 11, was also part of the household. Thomas Seymour's behaviour toward Elizabeth at Chelsea Manor is among the most uncomfortable and most discussed aspects of Catherine's final period. He entered Elizabeth's bedchamber in the mornings before she had risen, in his nightgown, in what appears to have been a pattern of behaviour that was inappropriate from the first occurrence and that continued despite the discomfort it caused. He was physically familiar with her in ways that went beyond what any appropriate guardian and ward relationship should have permitted. Her governess, Cat Ashley, found it alarming enough to remonstrate with him on multiple occasions. The testimonies gathered during the subsequent investigation into Seymour's conduct describe incidents: the morning visits, the tickling, a garden incident in which the fabric of Elizabeth's dress was cut apart while Catherine held the girl still, that paint a consistent picture of behaviour that had no acceptable justification. Catherine's role in what was happening was complicated and painful. She appears to have participated in the morning visits initially, perhaps believing that her presence made them less dangerous, or perhaps not yet fully understanding what she was witnessing. She was pregnant, in the final months before the birth of her first child, physically burdened, emotionally invested in the happiness she had finally found, perhaps unwilling to see clearly what was in front of her. In June of 1548, she saw it clearly. She found Thomas Seymour and Elizabeth in an embrace that could not be explained away or reframed. What Catherine had perhaps been managing and containing and telling herself was manageable, crystallized in that moment into something she could no longer pretend to misunderstand. She sent Elizabeth away. The princess was dispatched to the household of Sir Anthony and Lady Denny at Cheshunt. Good and trusted people would provide a safe and proper environment. Elizabeth left Chelsea Manor. The last surviving letter between them was written in these weeks, Elizabeth expressing concern for her stepmother's health during the final weeks of pregnancy. It is warm and careful, as all of Elizabeth's letters were, and it carries no overt acknowledgement of the circumstances that had led to the separation. Whatever Catherine wrote in reply, if she wrote at all, has not survived. The ending of Catherine and Elizabeth's shared household in these circumstances was a sorrow that sat alongside everything else the summer brought. The relationship between them had been one of the most genuine and most generative in Catherine's life. That it should conclude in the shadow of Thomas Seymour's recklessness and the broken confidence it represented was a particular kind of pain, the kind that comes not from an enemy's action, but from being hurt by the person one had chosen to love. In the spring of 1548, Catherine and Thomas moved to Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a magnificent property in the rolling Cotswold countryside, granted to Thomas as part of his elevation to Baron Seymour of Sudeley. It was beautiful. Old stone towers and long galleries and gardens, set in the gentle green landscape of a county that was quieter and more peaceful than anything Catherine had known for years. Lady Jane Grey was with them. The summer moved forward with the particular suspended quality of a time that is waiting for something. The summer of 1548 at Sudeley Castle was Catherine Parr's last season, though none of those around her knew it as it was happening. She was unwell in ways that went beyond the ordinary discomforts of pregnancy. Letters from Elizabeth and others from this period reflect awareness among those who cared for her that she was suffering more than she should have been, that the weeks before the birth were physically harder than they ought to have been. She was 35 or 36 years old. She was expecting her first child after a lifetime of childless marriages, and she was carrying, alongside the physical demands of pregnancy, the weight of everything the summer had brought: the discovery at Chelsea, the sending away of Elizabeth, the accumulated grief of finding that the love she had waited so long for was not quite what she had waited for it to be. On the 30th of August, 1548, at Sudeley Castle, Catherine Parr gave birth to a daughter. The baby was named Mary Seymour. She was Catherine's only child, the single living proof, after 4 marriages, that she was capable of motherhood. She had been born. She was healthy. Catherine, in the first hours after the delivery, was reported to be in good spirits. The household allowed itself a measure of relief. Within days, the relief was undone. Catherine developed a fever. The pattern was unmistakable and terrible to those who recognized it. The same pattern that had killed Jane Seymour 11 years before, after the birth of Prince Edward. Puerperal fever, as modern medicine names it. A bacterial infection that entered through the processes of birth and that, without any means of treating it, could move from high temperature to delirium to death, with a speed that left almost no time for adjustment or acceptance. The fever climbed. Catherine's condition worsened. The physicians attending her had nothing to offer beyond the treatments available to 16th century medicine. Herbal preparations, cooling cloths, prayers. None of it was sufficient, and those watching knew it. In the delirious hours that the fever produced, Catherine spoke things that those around her found difficult to understand and difficult to forget. Lady Tyrwhitt, who was present at Sudeley in those final days and who later gave testimony about what she had witnessed, described exchanges between Catherine and Thomas Seymour, in which Catherine, in her fever, gave voice to feelings of hurt and betrayal. The sense that she had not been loved as she deserved, the pain of the summer's discovery, the grief of a woman who had waited for this happiness through years of difficult duty and had found that it held, at its core, something broken. She reportedly told Thomas that he had not cared for her as he should have done. Whether these were the true and settled convictions of Catherine's clear mind, or whether they were the distortions of delirium, the amplifications that pain and illness produce in feelings that might otherwise be managed with more restraint, we cannot say with any certainty. What we can say is that they were the words of a woman who had been hurt, who had suppressed the fullness of that hurt through the ordinary courage of someone who did not give up on things easily and who found in the fever's stripping away of conscious management a voice that could no longer be controlled. Thomas Seymour, by Lady Tyrwhitt's account, was not at his best in these days. He was not the steady, present companion that the moment required. His particular kind of energy, outward-directed, physical, oriented toward the active world, found it difficult to contain itself within the small, quiet, irreversible space of a deathbed. He was there, and he was not fully there. In the early hours of the 5th of September, 1548, between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, by the record of those present, Catherine Parr died at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. She was 35 or 36 years old, the woman who had outlasted Henry VIII, who had talked her way free of a heresy warrant, who had governed England in the king's absence and published books in her own name and shaped the lives of 3 future monarchs, died of childbed fever 6 days after giving birth to her only child. Her body was prepared and encased in lead, as was customary for someone of royal rank, and the chapel of St. Mary's at Sudeley was draped in the formal black of royal mourning. The burial took place on the 7th of September. The service was conducted by Miles Coverdale, the Reformist scholar who had produced the first complete printed English Bible, one of the most consequential figures of the English Reformation. A man whose presence at her grave was entirely fitting for a woman who had given so much of her intellectual and spiritual life to the cause he had served. The chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey, the 11-year-old girl, small and composed and serious, dressed in mourning black, walking at the head of the funeral procession with a gravity that everyone who encountered her found striking, performed the role with complete solemnity. She would herself be dead within 6 years, another young woman consumed by the machinery of Tudor succession politics. But on this September morning, she was simply a child paying honour to a woman who had been kind to her. The service was, by the record, the first Protestant funeral conducted in England, Scotland, or Ireland, with a service in the English language, the vernacular tongue rather than the Latin of the old rite. It was a small, quiet, and entirely fitting final act for a woman whose life had been dedicated, in large part, to the principle that the sacred should be accessible to the ordinary person in the ordinary language of their daily life. Catherine Parr was interred in St. Mary's Chapel at Sudeley Castle, where her remains lie today, one of the very few of Henry VIII's 6 wives who still rests in her original place of burial. The Cotswold landscape she had barely come to know was the landscape in which she was left. The castle she had arrived at only months before was the place she would never leave. The threads that Catherine Parr had held together in her hands unravelled quickly in the months after her death, in ways that were both predictable and heartbreaking. Thomas Seymour's trajectory was swift and fatal. With Catherine gone and his brother firmly established as Lord Protector, Thomas was free to pursue his schemes without the moderating presence that Catherine might have provided. The steady, intelligent counsel of someone who understood him well enough to anticipate where his particular combination of ambition and recklessness was likely to lead. He attempted to cultivate an independent financial relationship with the young King Edward VI, secretly supplying the boy king with money outside the official channels of council oversight. He continued to seek ways to undermine his brother's position. There are suggestions in the record that he made overtures in Elizabeth's direction even after Catherine's death, approaches that reflected an ambition undimmed by anything that had happened and unrestrained by anyone's presence. He was arrested in January of 1549, charged with a long list of treasonous activities. He was tried and condemned. On the 20th of March, 1549, Thomas Seymour was executed on Tower Hill. He was approximately 40 years old. He had been married to Catherine Parr for less than 2 years. His execution left their daughter Mary Seymour an orphan before she had completed her first year of life. Catherine's friends and associates did what they could. Her brother William Parr, the Marquess of Northampton, took an interest in the child's welfare. Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk, one of Catherine's closest and most valued friends, took Mary into her household and provided care. But the practical circumstances were difficult. Thomas Seymour's attainder had stripped his estate, and the resources available for maintaining even a modest noble household for his infant daughter were severely limited. The surviving letters from this period express the financial difficulty with considerable candour. And then, around 1550, Mary Seymour disappears from the record entirely. She is mentioned in documents from 1549 and the early weeks of 1550. After that, there is nothing. No record of her death. No record of her adult life. She simply ceases to appear. Most historians conclude that she died in early childhood, that the disruptions and difficulties of her circumstances, combined with the ordinary terrible vulnerability of 16th century infancy, ended a life that had barely begun. The child for whom Catherine gave her own life did not survive to carry anything of her mother forward, except the mystery of her absence. The fate of Catherine's remains at Sudeley Castle followed its own complicated and undignified path through the centuries. The Reformation and its aftermath, the redistribution of church properties and the upheavals of subsequent reigns, were not gentle with the graves of the past. Sometime after Catherine's burial, in circumstances not entirely clear, her tomb was disturbed. Contemporary accounts reference the Queen's tomb at Sudeley being opened and the body exposed. Whether through deliberate desecration or the morbid curiosity of people who wanted to see what the lead coffin contained. The precise nature of the violation is not fully established, but that it happened is clear enough. When the Reverend Treadway Nash examined the tomb in October of 1786 for scholarly purposes, he found a body still remarkably well preserved. The lead casing having protected it from the full effects of centuries of time in ways that struck those present as almost extraordinary. Nash noted that the Queen had been small in stature. The face had decayed beyond recognition, but the body was otherwise largely intact. It was, in its strange way, a final echo of something characteristic, the quality of preservation, of outlasting what should have overwhelmed, that had marked so much of Catherine Parr's living years. Victorian restoration brought Sudeley Castle renewed attention in the 19th century and restored the chapel and its famous tomb. Catherine Parr became, in the popular historical writing of the age, a figure of some interest, the survivor queen, the one who outlasted all the others. It was the beginning of a recovery of her reputation that has continued, deepened, and become considerably more precise in the centuries and decades since. But the most significant aspects of Catherine Parr's legacy cannot be found in stone or restoration. They live in consequences. The most immediate and most consequential is the relationship between Catherine and Elizabeth. The education that Catherine shaped and encouraged, the humanist curriculum, the multiple languages, the Protestant faith mediated through personal engagement with Scripture, the daily example of a woman who thought and argued and governed and wrote, produced something that shaped the whole course of English history. Elizabeth I, who became Queen in 1558 and reigned for 45 years, was in significant ways the intellectual and spiritual daughter of Catherine Parr's care. The scholars who have studied the formation of Elizabeth's mind and character have documented the formative importance of her years in Catherine's household with considerable care. The evidence is in Elizabeth's earliest writing, its style, its theological concerns, its confident engagement with the great questions of the age, all of which show the marks of the environment Catherine created around her. The translation of prayers or meditations that the 13-year-old Elizabeth made into 3 languages as a gift to her father speaks not just to Elizabeth's gifts, but to what those gifts had been given to work on. Catherine Parr had placed a book in Elizabeth's hands, had encouraged her to engage with it seriously, and had watched as a remarkable girl demonstrated exactly what she was capable of. That encouragement, replicated in hundreds of daily interactions across the years of Henry's reign, was what Elizabeth had absorbed. She carried it forward for the rest of her life. The model of queenship that Elizabeth eventually practiced, learned, careful, politically astute, deeply Protestant, But managing that Protestantism with diplomatic intelligence, capable of governing directly and effectively, was in significant ways modelled on the example that Catherine Parr had set. Catherine had shown, in the practical context of real governance, that a woman could do all of these things simultaneously and well. She had been both the argument and the evidence. Elizabeth had watched her demonstrate it and had not forgotten what she saw. Some historians have argued that the whole shape of the Elizabethan era, its literary flowering, its theological settlement, its sense of national identity, its successful resistance of the Spanish Armada, bears the imprint, at several removes, of the woman who raised and shaped its defining monarch. It is not a claim that submits to simple proof, but it takes seriously the evidence of what Catherine Parr actually did and what she actually gave to the child who inherited her influence. And then there are the books, the Prayers or Meditations of 1545, the first original work published in English by a woman under her own name. A text that went through multiple editions in Catherine's lifetime and was read and valued across the subsequent decades. The Lamentation of a Sinner, published posthumously in 1547. The first conversion narrative in English, a literary form that would prove enormously generative in the centuries that followed. The scholarly edition of Catherine Parr's complete works, edited by Janelle Muller and published by the University of Chicago Press in 2011, established with full scholarly authority what careful readers had occasionally glimpsed across the intervening centuries. Catherine Parr was a writer of genuine quality and real literary significance, a pioneer whose contribution to English letters had been consistently undervalued by a historical tradition that had not always known how to account for a woman who was simultaneously queen, author, theologian, regent, and stepmother. She deserves to be remembered as herself, not as a footnote to the story of Henry VIII, not as the last entry in a numbered list, not primarily as the one who survived, as though survival were the whole of what she was. She deserves to be remembered as a woman who governed and wrote and believed and loved and shaped, in quiet and lasting ways, the England that came after her. She was born in the summer of 1512 to a courtier's family in London. She lost her father when she was 5 and her mother when she was 19. She was widowed at 20 and again at 30. She was taken hostage in a Yorkshire castle at 24. She became Queen of England at 31, governed the kingdom in the king's absence, published the first book in English written by a named female author, survived a heresy warrant through nothing but her own intelligence and courage, and died at 35 or 36, 6 days after giving birth to her only child, in a castle in the Cotswolds that she had only just come to know. She was, in the fullest and most demanding sense of the word, extraordinary. And so we come, gently, to the end of Catherine Parr's story, a story that has no easy ending, because the consequences of her life extended far beyond the moment of her death, and are still, in some ways, playing out in the England she helped to make. She survived Henry VIII, but she was not defined by that survival alone. She was defined by what she did with every year she was given, by the books she wrote, the children she raised, the kingdom she governed, the faith she held, and the courage with which she held it. She was defined by the specific, hard-won kind of wisdom that comes from living through genuine difficulty without allowing it to diminish you. The patience to manage what cannot be changed, the clarity to see what can be done, and the will to go ahead and do it. She was not a woman who sought the dramatic. She worked in the quieter registers, in the daily management of relationships and children and households and books, in the patient accumulation of small acts of care whose effects were enormous even when they were invisible. The 3 royal children she raised, a king and 2 queens, carried her influence forward into the whole subsequent shape of the English monarchy and the English Reformation. The books she published opened a door through which English women writers have been passing ever since. The governance she provided in Henry's absence demonstrated, in the most concrete possible way, that women could rule. She died too young, the most ordinary of human vulnerabilities. The same fever that had taken Jane Seymour 11 years before her accomplished what no king or bishop or political enemy had managed to do. She had survived so much, she could not survive this. But she had lived, fully and consequentially, and with the whole of herself. She had loved Thomas Seymour, complicated and imperfect, and ultimately painful as that love was. She had loved the 3 children who looked to her as their mother, and she had loved them well. She had loved the God whose presence she found in the scriptures she read and the prayers she wrote, and she had served that love through everything the world placed in her path. We carry her name tonight a little further into the future. We remember her, not as a footnote, not as a number, but as herself. Catherine Parr, Queen of England, author, scholar, regent, stepmother, woman of faith. A person of real consequence who left behind, in the books and the people she shaped, a legacy that outlasted everything that tried to diminish it. Thank you for spending this evening with Sleepy Crown Reborn. If Catherine's story has moved you tonight, we would be glad to hear from you in the comments. Which part of her life stayed with you the most? Or which of her 4 marriages you find the most fascinating? A gentle like helps more people find these stories and keeps our growing family together. Sleep well, and we will meet again very soon.